Hi guys, and welcome to another episode in a video series presented and funded by KupoCon, where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in the remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of The Nibelheim Incident, an award-winning novel and audiobook also produced by KupoCon, as well as my latest release, Norse Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of this series is to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within Remake, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. In the last episode, I spoke about Chapter 17's drum scenario, covering topics such as the implications of Sephiroth's appearance at the Jenova chamber, and Professor Hojo using the player characters as pawns in one of his experiments. This time around, I'll be breaking down the remainder of the chapter, it's self-titled Deliverance from Chaos. The video will inherently include spoilers for this section of the game, but anything beyond Chapter 17 is minimal and mainly speculation. However, if you're not familiar with the original Final Fantasy VII, there will very likely be heavy spoilers, and if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. At the end of the previous episode, Cloud, Barrett, Tifa, Aerith and Red 13 discovered the Jenova specimen had been removed from its tank, and a creepy trail of bubbling purple blood was winding its way towards the elevator at the height of the drum. The group decides to continue their ascent to the rooftop of the Shinra building, where Wedge has arranged to have them extracted by Avalanche HQ. They arrive at the 69th floor executive suite, only to find a continuation of the trail of blood, just as they do in the original Final Fantasy VII. Curiously, the trail takes the east staircase to the 70th floor, which is a mirror of the old game. On its own, there was a 50-50 chance of this occurring, but it's not an isolated example, as I'll come back to in a minute. There's a brilliant little detail in this area that I personally didn't spot, but it was recently pointed out by Twitter user Y2Jacer23. If you head towards the northwest corner of the suite's upper landing, there's a dark stain on the floor. This is where Palmer dropped his cup of tea during the cutscene in Chapter 16, when he witnessed Sephiroth striding past. Keep this in mind, because it establishes the time frame for when, let's say, an incarnation of Sephiroth arrives at the presidential office. Making their way into the office themselves, which ironically has yellow flowers at its entrance, the party finds it deserted. This might have come as an anticlimax for fans of the original, because discovering President Shinra murdered at his desk, skewered by Sephiroth's katana, was one of the most impactful scenes in the game. As I touched on in the previous video, however, the reason for the change may be less of an artistic choice and more of a censorship issue. I mentioned a moment ago that the direction of the trail of blood in Remake is a mirror image of the staircase used in the old game, and the same thing applies to the private exit of the presidential office. Where the door to the helipad was on the west wall before, it's now on the east. What makes this especially interesting is Aerith's behaviour when the characters begin to look around, as highlighted by my friend and content creator Vizuvizadh of the Cosmo Canyon Observatory. The flower girl will wander back and forth across the western half of the room, as if confused by the alternative layout presented in Remake. It's almost as if there are memories inside her that were expecting something different, which is something I discussed back in my first video covering this chapter. One Easter egg I was disappointed not to see was reference to the secret trapdoor beneath President Shinra's desk. According to the Shinra chapter of the official novel On the Way to a Smile, when Rufus was 5 years old and the tower was still under construction, he suggested to his father that such a hatch should be installed in case he ever needed to escape. The book describes Rufus surviving the diamond weapons attack on Midgar, whereas in the original game, it is heavily implied that the young president was killed. He does so by locating a button under the desk to open the trapdoor, then sliding down the chute to a safe room. The escape was never meant for President Shinra, however. It was made for Rufus, and the button was marked with an L for loser, just as his father promised. There's a giant hole in one of the windows on the eastern side of the room, and beyond it is President Shinra, dangling from a ledge as if some powerful force had launched him through the glass. Annoyingly, the details of what actually happened here are never properly clarified, though the implication is that Sephiroth is responsible. When the group reaches the president, he offers them money in exchange for saving his life. Barrett uses this opportunity to leverage power over the old man, catching the president when he loses his grip. Not only does this show remarkable character development from Barrett, who was a hot-headed eco-terrorist when he was introduced in Chapter 1, but it creates a comparison to the flashback in the original Final Fantasy VII, when his attempt to prevent his friend Dyne falling from the cliffside was unsuccessful. In a roundabout way, this is a degree of redemption. As payment for letting him live, Barrett demands President Shinra makes a public declaration that it was his company who destroyed Sector 7, and that Avalanche are not the people's enemy. However, he does not realise the president is scrambling back to his desk to find his gun, and is caught off guard. As I described back in my episode breaking down Chapter 16's Memorial Museum, the golden pistol being pointed at Barrett while the president lectures him about the complex dilemmas of a society that depends on advanced energy resources is reminiscent of Bond villain Francisco Scaramanga. His words really hit home though, especially given that Shinra's leadership is later gravely missed after the destruction of Meteor and the rise of Geostigma. With his fingers preparing to squeeze the trigger, President Shinra's eyes go wide, and we see he has been stabbed through the chest by Sephiroth's Masamune. Swirls of black mist surround the great blade, but there is no blood. Its absence here may be another censorship issue, but it might also be a callback to Aerith's death in Final Fantasy VII, where Sephiroth's sword is spotless after it pierces her back. Fans speculated for many years about whether this related to the Japanese folktale of the swordsmith Masamune, whose blades could be identified because they did not draw blood. In one of the most unexpected scenes in all of Final Fantasy VII Remake, Sephiroth then impales Barrett. Everything slows down to capture the shock of the moment, with the characters reacting one by one. Cloud is frozen to the spot, which is an accurate portrayal of how he might be incapacitated by his past trauma, having already witnessed people he loved being cut down by the former soldier hero. Barrett's injury is a wild deviation from the plot of the original game, and we soon see the Whispers, those so-called Arbiters of Fate, intervene on behalf of Destiny, trying to heal him. Meanwhile, Sephiroth wordlessly strides towards the president's desk, prompting Aerith to pause and watch him. His form flashes back and forth between the silver-haired antagonist and a monstrous skeletal face, one that veterans of the old Final Fantasy VII may have recognised from the Jenova birth, life and Death battle models. If the connection wasn't immediately obvious, it likely would have been by the time the Fiend materialised before the party in the illusionary environment, a trademark of Jenova's that is even mentioned in her enemy intel bio. Aerith states that the being is the source of everything, which raises a couple of interesting questions. Did she learn about Jenova, who the Cetra called the Calamity from the Skies, from her birth mother, Ifalna? Or is her knowledge tied to the memories of the future she has access to? And is Aerith conscious that the extraterrestrial monster is responsible for the decimation of her entire race? There are a few intriguing things to point out about the encounter itself. First of all, being thrust into the battle immediately after Barrett is stabbed parallels the fight against Jenova Life in the original game, which occurs right after Aerith has been killed by Sephiroth. The design of the creature is very similar to its predecessors. That said, it does include two primary tentacles that more closely resemble those of the Jenova synthesis boss, fought in the depths of the northern cave. A further allusion to that particular battle can be found on the floor of the current hallucination, where the outlines of asymmetric blocks are seen. There are also substantial masses of organic material surrounding the arena. This may be a callback to the matter that accompanies the Jenova specimen in the tanks at both the Mount Nebo reactor facility and Hojo's lab in the old game. The English localisation of Remake calls this version of the Fiend Jenova Dreamweaver, which is a reference to her powers of illusion. However, other regional translations name her Jenova Pulse, while the initial Japanese was closer to Jenova Beat. The context of this, of course, is Heartbeat. In the original Final Fantasy VII, the first Jenova boss encounter does not take place until the cargo ship between Junon and Costa del Sol. Given that variant was Jenova Birth, and part of the birth-life-death cycle, to battle another variant earlier in the Remake continuity would suggest this was pre-birth, hence Jenova Heartbeat. As if to confirm this, the music track that plays during the fight is called Jenova Quickening, where the term quickening, in a medical sense, is the moment in pregnancy when a woman starts to feel her baby's movement. When the third phase of the battle commences, Cloud and the others have to contend with globules of a harmful black substance raining down on them. This may be an allusion to geostigma, or, more specifically, the malevolent black liquid that can cause the condition in those who come into contact with it, as is the case with Rufus Shinra and Yuffie's friend Yuri during the novel On the Way to a Smile. Geostigma occurs when the body tries to rid itself of Jenova particles, but overcompensates and begins attacking itself. Upon the defeat of Jenova, the hallucination ends. Rather than Sephiroth standing by the president's desk, however, it is Marco, the robed figure who lived beside Cloud and Tifa at Stargazer Heights. Marco slumps to his knees dead, and beside him is the headless Jenova specimen, wrapped in black cloth. As Cloud steps forward, Sephiroth reappears and picks up the mummified remains of his mother, without saying a word, but has his attention drawn by the approaching Avalanche helicopter. The craft is one of Shinra's B-09 models, implying Avalanche HQ have stolen it and repurposed it at some point. When Cloud turns back, he sees Sephiroth has somehow made it outside, and watches him float towards the roof of the tower. Cloud follows the silver-haired villain and shouts up to him, but the whispers intervene. Amid the commotion, the Sephiroth carrying Jenova is shown to be nothing more than another illusion, It is in fact the robed figure from Chapter 8, the one with the tattoo number 2 on his arm. Saying nothing, the man topples from the tower, still clutching the specimen, and vanishes towards the city below. There's quite a lot to unpack from all this. It's important to establish though that while the scene plays out very differently from the original, the specific manner in which Jenova escapes Shinra HQ has not been contradicted. If anything, it has provided clarity to a plot element of the old game, where the party is repeatedly told during their pursuit of Sephiroth and Jenova about a man or men in black capes, with a tattoo on their hand. When the player re-enters the Sector 5 slums towards the end of Final Fantasy VII, they can learn that the sick guy in the pipe, who was tattooed number 2, has recently gone missing. I've also deliberately highlighted in this episode's breakdown that Sephiroth does not speak in the presidential office. This better reflects Cloud's encounters with Marco in Chapter 3 and the robed figure in Chapter 8, both of whom he hallucinated to be Sephiroth. The initial remake Ultimania confirms one of these two figures, most probably Marco, takes the form of Sephiroth in the drum to converse with the group. The difference in Chapter 17 is that the illusion is caused by their immediate proximity to Jenova, whereas those in Chapter 3 and 8 relate to a reaction of the Jenova cells in Cloud's body. All this of course was foreshadowed in the vision of Meteor Fall during Chapter 16's sequence at the entertainment hall. I mentioned way back in my last Chapter 8 episode, covering the scene at the children's hideout, that I had a theory regarding what the line art image on the black cloaks of the Sephiroth clones might be. It's difficult to get a proper look at it in Remake, but it can be found in the material Ultimania, and later observed by Yuffie in episode Intermission. I've seen a number of hypotheses online, including an excellent article by ex-soldier of thelifestream.net, which speculates links between the 7 strokes of the art and the image shown during the original game's prelude, or to the Sephiroth of Jewish Kabbalist mysticism. I'm with many other fans in believing that the image is a depiction of Jenova, specifically her Dreamweaver battle form. My theory relates to the short story by Kazushige Najima, titled Picturing the Past, which provides details about who the cloaked figures are, and the origins of the painting on Aerith's bedroom wall at Shinra HQ. In short, when Aerith's Septrin abilities first manifested, she began illustrating the visions she was having. These were primarily of landscapes, which President Shinra interpreted to be the Promised Land, so he sent volunteers of a special survey unit to investigate. The survivors of this unit suffered awful Mako poisoning and were later experimented on by Professor Hojo, identified by number tattoos and these unique robes. It is my belief that the Jenova artwork on their backs was originally created by Aerith during one of her childhood visions. This is loosely supported in the material Ultimania, where developer notes state the image should look as if it was drawn by a finger dipped in paint. Before Cloud heads outside, Barrett comes back to life, having been resurrected by one of the Whispers. Red 13 tells him that this death is not the one that was ordained for him by the planet. This is an important concept to keep in mind, especially if the character's destinies should, somehow, become uncertain for future installments of Remake. The implications it has for Aerith in particular have become one of the biggest questions among Remake's fans. It's also worth pointing out that as Cloud makes his way to the helipad, 3 Whispers can be seen hovering in place up ahead. They seem to be observing Barrett's recovery, and fly off when Cloud approaches, Perhaps these are the same three spectres that tried to intervene when Biggs was injured on the pillar in Chapter 12. As the party prepares to be evacuated by the Avalanche helicopter, the craft is suddenly shot out of the sky by an approaching chopper, piloted by Reno and Rude. The two men are unlikely to have had any unease over that action, as Avalanche and the Turks have a long history as enemies, predominantly shown in Before Crisis. Vice President Rufus Shinra, heir to the Shinra Corporation and only 30 years old, according to the Remake Ultimania, is aboard the flight, playing with a pair of silver coins, but I'll come back to these in a minute. Rufus's introduction in Remake is slightly different to that of the old game, where the group run out to the helipad to confront him. This time around, they start to leave before the craft lands, but Cloud pauses when he realises the VP is present. Our hero immediately orders Barrett to get the others to safety, thus bypassing the conversation they have with the new president in the original. Two memorable parts of that exchange, where the individuals identify themselves, then Rufus explains how he will control the world with fear, are implemented elsewhere, as I'll highlight in due course. There are also a few significant changes to Rufus's overall design. Perhaps the most noticeable is that the coattails of his white jacket are now less businesslike and more JRPG appropriate. However, despite many of the features looking as if they have received a heavy dose of Tetsuya Nomura style, Rufus's new appearance is actually the work of lead artist Roberto Ferrari. Developer comments in the Material Ultimania also reveal that this was one of the most difficult designs to get right in terms of detail and 3D modelling. In addition, Rufus's hair has been updated to match the light blonde variant that appears in Advent Children, which is pretty distinct from the bright auburn of the original game. As before, he is accompanied by an elite guardhound who joins him in battle, described in the enemy intel as a one-off breed, willing to die to protect its master. According to the English localization of Remake, the dog's name is Darkstar, which seems to be a late amendment, because the old Final Fantasy VII, the Japanese version of Remake, and the English art book that was released with the deluxe edition of the game all call the beast Dark Nation. Just like in the original, a good tactic during the battle is to defeat Darkstar as quickly as possible, thus nullifying his protection of Rufus. The new President's gun has also been revamped for Remake. Despite his prominent role in the story, Rufus has only ever fought once in the old game. During that encounter, his weapon is a standard shotgun, but a unique, stylish version was introduced for Advent Children. The Material Ultimania provides artwork for an abandoned concept that would have seen Rufus wield a similar firearm to the latter in Remake, but it was eventually decided that the detachable barrel element the developers wanted worked better with a front-to-back design. As such, Rufus's custom shotgun can now transform into dual weapons. Having said all that, it's unclear if we'll ever see these again, because Cloud knocks them off the tower at the end of the fight. Both before and during the battle, Remake goes out of its way to emphasise Rufus being in the possession of silver coins, like I mentioned earlier. Their purpose in this scenario is to offer a different dynamic to his attacks, where various moves have the President toss coins into the air and shoot them, or throw them on the ground to emit electricity. The player is only afforded a quick glimpse of the details on the coins, but they do include a couple of great Easter eggs. On one side is a sword, shield and wings motif, accompanied by words such as ever forward and reign supreme. The most intriguing of these is Shinra Inc. A New Era. Not only would Rufus have to have had these made prior to the death of his father, but New Age is the slogan used on the banners in the original game during his reception parade at Junon. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise to fans of the compilation, because Rufus's involvement with Avalanche during Before Crisis is motivated by his desire to supplant the president. Avalanche's activities even included an assassination attempt. The other side of the coins is more difficult to see during gameplay, but it too is presented in full in Remake's material Ultimania. This side depicts Darkstar and a Mandragora blossom, a flower which, in Japanese culture, traditionally symbolises fear. As I touched on before, this is a deliberate allusion to the speech Rufus gives the party when they meet on the helipad in the old Final Fantasy VII. He states that his father controlled the world with money, but he will instead control it with fear. This ties in nicely with lore details provided in the original game's Ultimania Omega, where it is revealed that Vice President Rufus was typically left out of the loop on business decisions, because his father found his ideologies to be too dangerous. It should also be highlighted that the purple Mandragora is the third flower type in Remake to have direct or indirect symbolism, because yellow flowers are said to represent a reunion between two people, while white flowers represent loyalty. At the end of the battle, Rufus is lifted off the platform by the helicopter, which hovers back and forth above them for much of the fight, just as it does in the original. Rather than simply carry him away, however, the Turks turn their guns on Cloud, causing a section of the metal grating to collapse beneath his feet. As he hangs onto a girder below, his grip loosening, Tifa sprints across the platform and grabs his hand in the nick of time. Tifa's involvement here is a callback to the old game, where Cloud finds her waiting for him on the 69th floor, but this version comes with another subtle reference. She tells Cloud that if he wants to play the hero, he has to be better, which very likely relates to the promise they made at the Nibelheim Water Tower all those years ago. The scene transitions to Barrett, Aerith and Red 13 in one of the external glass elevators, descending towards the 59th floor. Veteran fans might recall that the trio has to battle against the 100 Gunner and then Heli Gunner in an adjacent lift during the corresponding section of the original. While the Heli Gunner, renamed the Valkyrie in the English localisation of Remake, was encountered and dispatched in Chapter 15, the 100 Gunner, now called the Arsenal, does make an appearance, despite the ridiculousness of trying to fit an armoured tank into such a cramped space. This time around though, the fight itself takes place in the Skyview atrium. During all this, focus switches to Wedge, who is creeping around the 64th floor. He sees the elevator with the others on it plunge past, and decides to help his friends. However, the Whispers have other plans. Not only do they prevent Wedge from moving, it would appear they actively force him out of the window, suggesting this is where he dies. Perhaps the Arbiters simply determined that the young Avalanche operative had escaped his destiny for too long. Perhaps his death was the price for the Whispers saving Barrett's life. Or perhaps the Leaf House scene at the end of Remake might offer some hope for Wedge. One thing to keep in mind is that his final line of dialogue, "I'm sorry Cloud, just tell me that I made a difference," is very similar to the last line the character speaks in the old game, after he falls from the Sector 7 pillar. And finally, When Barrett, Aerith and Red 13 make it to the ground floor lobby of Shinra HQ, they are soon surrounded by infantrymen from the forecourt. This is a change from the original, but not necessarily conflicting, because the group were previously aware of the force that had gathered off-screen, beyond the building's entrance. The presence of Heidegger in this version also allows the characters to have their introduction moment, which, as I mentioned, has been moved from the Rufus conversation in Final Fantasy VII. Red 13's self-identification as Labrat Dog, a callback to Barrett's clumsy description of him at the start of the chapter, made me laugh out loud, paralleling his previous introduction as a research specimen. I've referenced this a couple of times across my breakdown series, but almost every vehicle that appears in Remake has the same format on its license plate: SHR, then 3 digits. One of the most notable exceptions to this is the blue pickup that Tifa drives during the escape sequence, which instead reads SA-37. As it happens, SA-37 is the model type of the vehicle, as shown in the 3D rendered artwork of the old game. For me personally, seeing this cutscene play out was a real highlight of my Remake experience. I was blown away by the corresponding FMV when I was a kid, and it remains to this day one of my most memorable moments in gaming. So, this has been my recap of the conclusion to Chapter 17. I hope you enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads of my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim incident, and so much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork, behind the scenes podcasts, or mythology and Final Fantasy articles, etc. And please consider picking up a copy of my book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which is now also available as an audiobook and special edition hardback. The links to each edition can be found on my Patreon at www.patreon.com/MJ Gallagher. I would additionally like to thank KupoCon for commissioning this series, and encourage all viewers to support their channel and brand. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, and I'll speak to you again soon.